Hello, debaters! By now, you're probably starting to see that debate is a bit more complex than one team saying yes and the opposing team saying no. Every debate round is filled with lots of different arguments going back and forth, and each argument deserves its own course of development, so that by the end of the round, both teams have had a chance to respond and reply. If teams aren't organized and efficient, arguments can be dropped, forgotten, and mismanaged. And when that happens, debaters start losing rounds. In order to keep track of all the arguments, debaters have developed a system of note-taking called flowing. Flowing is the verb, as in to flow, and the actual set of notes taken in a round is a noun, as in the flow. You'll hear debaters refer to the flow frequently during the round. So let's get started. A flow is actually several sheets of blank copy paper. Die-hard debaters have their preferences about which type of paper to use, and some even prefer to flow on their laptops. But the basic structure is always the same, so let's start with the basics. Each argument in the round gets its own sheet of paper. So if there are 3 contentions and 3 advantages in the 1AC, you'd use 6 different sheets of paper. If there are 2 contentions and 3 advantages, you'd use 5 different sheets of paper. And negative teams don't have to know in advance how many contentions or advantages there are in the 1AC. You'll just keep starting new pieces of paper each time they start a new contention or advantage. So let's say that the 1AC has 2 contentions and 3 advantages. The first contention is inherency, the second contention is solvency, and then there's the first, second, and third advantage. You'll also recall that the plan text is read somewhere in the 1AC, and most debaters flow the plan text on the solvency flow or the solvency piece of paper. Now let's take a look at what you've accomplished by the end of the 1AC. You have 5 pieces of paper, and each piece of paper contains your notes on each of the 5 different arguments made during the 1AC. In a few minutes, I'll show you what to write on each piece of paper and how to write it, but for now, let's go to the 1NC. The first negative constructive includes 2 types of arguments, offensive and defensive. Offensive arguments add new arguments introduced in the 1NC, such as disadvantages, topicality, counterplans, and critiques. Defensive arguments are responses to arguments made by the opposing team, and that includes the 5 arguments made in the 1AC. In terms of flowing the 1NC, each new argument gets a new piece of paper, and each defensive argument is flowed on the existing pieces of paper from the 1AC. So let's say the 1NC has a topicality argument and 2 disadvantages. These are 3 new arguments, so they would require 3 new pieces of paper. But the 1NC just doesn't consist of 3 new arguments. It also needs to respond to the 5 arguments made in the 1AC. That means your flow will contain a total of 8 pieces of paper by the end of the 1NC. The good news is that teams usually don't introduce new arguments after the 1NC, so you probably won't ever be adding a 9th argument to the round, which means not adding a 9th piece of paper. Now let's take a look at actually how to use your flow during a round. And for example, let's say you are the 1NC. During the 1AC, you're flowing everything, the taglines, the sources, and the evidence. That might seem like a lot, but I'll show you some shorthand techniques to make it easy. By the end of the 1AC, you've got 5 pieces of paper that contain your notes from the 1AC. Your goal as the 1NC is to use the 3 minutes of cross-examination and a couple of minutes of prep time to do the following. First, you need to add your responses to each of the existing arguments made in the 1AC. You don't need a lot of responses, but you'll need to respond in some way to each sheet of paper. Second, you need to create a new sheet of paper for each of your offensive arguments like topicality or disads. And on each sheet, you need to pre-write your arguments. Third, you'll need to be pulling any evidence you need to make all your arguments. Now, of course, that sounds difficult, but you will get the hang of it pretty quickly. And when you're done with all that, you'll have a thing of beauty. You have your 3 new arguments on 3 separate sheets of paper, and you'll have 5 sheets of paper that have their original arguments plus your responses. And here's why that's beautiful. When you stand up to give your speech, you start with your first offensive argument, make the argument, read the necessary evidence, then set that flow down and move to the next argument. Make that argument, read the evidence, set that flow down, and move to your next argument, and so forth, and so on until you get through all 8 sheets of paper. And if that sounds really difficult, I want to remind you that I talked in previous videos about shells and front lines. Remember those? Shells are pre-written offensive arguments with evidence that you create Monday through Friday. Front lines are pre-written defensive arguments with evidence that you create Monday through Friday. So, instead of cutting a full topicality argument from scratch during prep time, you can simply pull the file that you've pre-written and read it with as much ease as the first affirmative reads his or her 1AC. Now, just imagine that you want to run 1 topicality and 2 disadvantages. If you already have those shells already written, then you won't need more than 20 seconds of prep time to pull those arguments from your files and organize them with your flow. Let's say that the affirmative team proposes to end the use of drones. For example, in their inherency argument, they will predictably argue that the use of drones is widespread and increasing, and they'll read evidence to prove their point. While they are reading their evidence, you are simultaneously listening to their evidence and flowing what they say. But you're also accessing your files and pulling the evidence that shows that the government use of domestic drones is narrow, targeted, and very specific. Now, if your evidence is well organized, you might even have your evidence ready to go before they finish reading their evidence. As for your offensive arguments, like your dissents, those files should be ready to go as well. You knew you'd be debating drones at some point, so you created a disadvantage that showed how drones are uniquely able to gather surveillance of illegal marijuana production. And without drones, the violence and criminal association with the illegal drug trade would skyrocket. You don't even need to know the exact details of the affirmative case to make this a disadvantage. They want to end drones, and you can show that drones are good, so you create the disadvantage before you even get to the tournament. You can put the 3 or 4 necessary pieces of evidence together in one file and save it on your laptop or file it in your box. It only takes about 5 seconds to find the file and add it to your speech. I mentioned earlier that you probably wouldn't be adding new pieces of paper to the flow after the 1NC. So let's shift gears and talk about what gets written on each piece of paper. Flows are organized in vertical columns, and each column represents one speech. There are 8 speeches in the round, including constructives and rebuttals, but since most debaters flow the negative block in one column, you need to leave enough space to develop the argument across 7 columns. Here's an example of an actual flow for a drone's disadvantage given in the 1NC. You can clearly see the uniqueness, link, internal link, and impact, each part of the disadvantage. Note that each element includes a summary of the tagline, the author, and date, and a few key points from each piece of evidence. Some arguments, like inherency, might only have one piece of evidence. Other arguments, like advantages, might have lots of pieces of evidence. And still others, like topicality and disads, have a predictable number of arguments. Now let's look and see how our example disadvantage flow is developing in the 2AC. You can see that the 2AC has added his or her responses in the next column, and the responses are organized so that each response is paired with the original argument it answers. This adds an important layer of organization to your speeches. If you are the 2AC in this example, you could easily stand up, reference the original argument, and give your responses. A good flow can even let you organize your responses in a few ways. For example, you could have line-by-line responses in which you have one or more responses to each of their arguments, or you could group their responses and provide one or more responses of your own, or you could even cross-apply your previous arguments, much like copying and pasting. These options save you time during your speech, and a well-kept flow allows you to organize your responses effectively. After a while, you'll also learn some important symbols that save you time. Up and down arrows mean increase and decrease. A circled S means solvency, and squared author and dates indicates evidence. A horizontal arrow means leads to or causes, and the list goes on and on. Take a moment to ask some of your teammates what symbols they use. Before we close, I want to spend a few minutes talking to you about roadmaps. Roadmaps are a small but important feature in debate rounds, and implementing them correctly requires finesse. In most areas of the country, every speech except the 1AC and all cross-examinations begins with a roadmap. A roadmap is a very brief explanation of the order of arguments. A good roadmap should last maybe 5 to 10 seconds. The roadmap has a very narrow and specific purpose, and that purpose is to let other participants in the round know how many pieces of paper they'll need to flow your speech and the order in which you'll give those arguments. As you continue with debate, you'll start experiencing rounds that move faster, and the faster the rounds move, the less time everyone will have to shuffle paper during your speech. So your goal is to give enough information about your upcoming speech that everyone has enough paper in the correct order that they can simply turn the page when you move on to the next argument. And the next page in their stack corresponds with the next argument you'll be making in your stack. You just learned that each argument gets its own piece of paper. That means inherency, solvency, and each of the advantages gets written on a separate sheet of paper. By the end of the 1AC, everyone who is flowing, which includes all 4 debaters and oftentimes the judge, should have about 5 pieces of paper after the 1AC, sometimes more, sometimes less. The roadmap before the 1NC should first list the number of pieces of papers that will be needed to flow the off-case arguments, and the order of the paper needed to flow the on-case or case arguments. The roadmap should not list the type of arguments or the nature of them, only the number and sequence of them. So let's say, for example, that you walk up to the front of the room with your 1NC in hand. The 1NC includes a topicality argument, 2 disadvantages, and a counterplan, and it responds to solvency and each of the 3 advantages. First, ask if anyone is not ready. That allows anyone who is still analyzing their flows to let you know if they aren't ready for your roadmap. And it's better to ask if anyone is not ready rather than asking if everyone is ready, because asking if everyone is ready requires everyone to respond, whereas asking if anyone is not ready gives anyone the chance to speak now or forever hold his or her peace. Second, say that you are going to give a brief roadmap to all who are taking notes. Then say the number of off-case arguments you have, followed by the sequence of case arguments in the order you want to tackle them. So in our example, we had topicality, 2 disads, and a counterplan. So that'd be 4 off-case. And we wanted to respond to solvency and each of the advantages. So your roadmap would look exactly like this. Is anyone not ready? Before we begin the timer, I'd like to offer a brief roadmap for the benefit of anyone taking notes. I'll have 4 off-case arguments, and then I'll respond to solvency and each of the advantages in order. Notice that your roadmap only took about 5 seconds, and you didn't reveal any of your new arguments. You didn't say anything like, I'll have the topicality, 2 disads, and a counterplan. And you didn't say things like, I'll show how the plan doesn't solve because the government is ineffective. And you didn't say that for 2 reasons. First, you didn't say that because the point you were making your arguments, the timer should be started. Second, you didn't say that because you didn't want to give the affirmative team a heads up on the arguments you were making. If you tell the other team the nature of your solvency argument, it might be 6 minutes into the 1NC before you actually get to solvency, so that gives the other team 6 minutes to prepare the argument you haven't even made yet. Instead, you only let others know how many pieces of paper they would need. After providing your roadmap, give everyone a chance to take out 4 new pieces of paper and organize their solvency and advantage pages in the order you gave. Because of your roadmap, all flowing participants can now just flip their pages as you transition to new arguments. No shuffling, no reorganizing. In summary, flowing and roadmaps are an essential function of a good debate round, but they take some work. Today's video gives you all the information you need to be successful, but it cannot replace the experience of actually flowing and giving roadmaps. The importance of an accurate and clean flow can't be underestimated, so make it a priority to get better and better with each round. That's all for now, debaters. Good luck.